Hello, my name is Ted Wiggins. Today, I'm going to tell you a story of what may have seemed a typical day to any normal intern, but there was nothing normal about today. It was my first day as an intern at Nickelodeon Studios. They picked me up after receiving my associate's degree from ITT Tech. It was a stupid school, but it taught me what I needed for this chance. Running donuts and making coffee sucked. I can tell you that much. But it had its perks. Me being on the road of an editor, I sometimes received the opportunity to see episodes before they were officially released. Today, I was invited into the editing studio. But you see, it was odd. There was no one in there. Normally, this would cost me my internship, but I couldn't resist the urge. It was overwhelming, encompassing. That feeling. As soon as I walked in, the door slammed behind me. I figured this was one of those somewhat cruel pranks the editors sometimes pulled on the new guys. So when the door locked, I figured this was some kind of punishment, and my heart slowly sank. My internship was in huge jeopardy. They probably already knew I was here. Panicking, I ran at the door with all of my force, slamming into it with all my might. Not to boast, but I wasn't the weakest guy. I had been working out for the past 3 years, but dear Lord, there was something on the other side of that door. Some force stronger than the strongest man, making sure I couldn't leave until I did what I was sent in to do. Now in my panic, I hadn't noticed the netbook, the chair, and the small table it was sitting on. In the disc tray, there was a blank CD. Usually these were editing discs, completely cherry episodes just barely leaving production. It didn't have any markings or even a name, but something beckoned me. Something pushed me to the chair and forced me to sit. As I slowly pulled the chair back, my heart rate slowly increased. You could almost hear it in my chest. I slowly pushed the DVD tray shut. Without any prompt or confirmation, it just started. Something seemed odd straight away. Normally, it would open in VLC or Windows Media Player. However, this was odd. It just opened, with no video player. It seemed the computer itself was just a video player. But it couldn't be. It seemed just like any normal netbook the interns or staff carried. As the title card flashed, I could immediately see my first assumption was wrong. It wasn't a cherry or slightly edited build. They never had title cards. This was either finished or just ready to leave production. The title card seemed odd. I had never seen anything like it. Instead of the usual fun font they used that popped and seemed colorful, of course to appeal more to children, it seemed more gothic, something you would see in a horror film. The words in the title card made my heart sink farther. It had to be a joke, right? Why would someone try to scare me this terribly though? The words read, "You nosy intern, you shouldn't have come in here." And the usual happy bubble transition that we were all used to was gone. The text just melted down the screen, almost like blood running down a wall. It slowly faded into the show from a couple seconds of utter silence. It transitioned into one of the familiar openings, with Spongebob slowly snoring in bed, and Gary sleeping beside him on his newspaper. The blowhole of an alarm clock was there. Even the bed was. I began to feel relieved. I remembered all this from when I was a kid. It seemed normal. I was expecting the blowhole to go off, and Spongebob to start his typical routine. But it didn't come. There must have been at least 3 minutes of just Spongebob snoring. Then something finally happened. It started to slowly pan into his face, so slowly, waiting in anticipation, just dying for something to finally happen. As it finally reached deep into his face, you could clearly see his expression. It was one of horror and of malice, one that someone in a terrible nightmare would have. His eyes almost seemed as if they had been stitched shut. It then had a transition, not the usual fade to black or the joyful bubbles, but something altogether much more sinister. It was a fiery transition, almost like the previous screen had just burned up. By all appearances, we were now in SpongeBob's mind, in his dream, his nightmare. It appeared to be Bikini Bottom, but something was very wrong. The whole city seemed in shambles, the horizon blood red, the buildings burning, SpongeBob just walking down the road. It seemed the typical path he would normally take to the Krusty Krab. The people around him, though, were screaming blood-curdling screams. Screams that most adults would find morbid at this point. Screams that were hard to get out of your mind. At this point, I couldn't see who it was coming from. Just SpongeBob walking, slowly, silently, as the screaming slowly continued, getting louder and louder. As he turned the corner, I saw the source of the screams. It was terrifying, horrible, inhuman. It was Patrick, hammered into a stake almost like the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. But his stomach had been torn open. His entrails were slowly leaking out. The look on his face, seeing SpongeBob, he seemed relieved for a moment, almost as if his salvation had come. His eyes began to water, just staring at SpongeBob, almost beckoning. His eyes spoke for him. They screamed, "Please help me." We then transitioned over to SpongeBob, who just stood there, staring back at Patrick, watching his friend slowly suffer and die. Patrick then began to weep, almost as if he understood something that the viewer did not. SpongeBob opened his mouth, and in a low, almost satanic, demonic voice, he whispered, "Suffer, fat one. You, this whole town brought this upon themselves." And then he turned and walked away. At this moment, I screamed out in horror, almost praying that someone would hear me, that someone would walk in. It would cost me my internship, but anything to end this. You may find yourself thinking, why didn't you just stand up and attempt once more to escape? But I couldn't. Something deep down told me that if I moved, I would regret it. I had to finish watching. I just had to. SpongeBob then continued down the road, approaching the Krusty Krab, and in the background you could now hear more screams. Some were horrible, blood-curdling ones that you could tell came from one in great agony. But there had been one new sound thrown in, a horrible, twisted laugh, one of great malice, almost as if someone had been hunting an animal and thoroughly enjoying himself all too much. You could hear them very distinctly, fading away into the background, as if they were chasing someone, something, in the other direction. SpongeBob seemed unfazed, as if he was almost used to it. You could now hear something clattering behind him, breaking the mind-numbing silence. It sounded almost as if something was crawling toward him. SpongeBob then slowly turned, as if he expected this. As he turned, his face came into view, and his eyes had changed. They no longer seemed to be his normal, happy, joyful-looking eyes. They were blood red and full of hate and anger. One would expect this face from a demon. Even the devil himself would find this look fitting. I myself now began to weep, with no end to the horror in sight. His eyes were now fixed on something. It transitioned over to Patrick. His entire lower body was now missing, with his intestines trailing behind him. What was left of his arms had huge holes in them, almost as if something had been torn out. The nails. Had he ripped himself off of the stake? His face came up. His eyes beckoned once more to Spongebob, but this time they said something different. He began to speak, and I'll never forget those words. Kill me. Please. I'm sorry. We're all sorry. Just end it, please. I can't take the pain. Spongebob responded with a hellish tone even worse than before. You ask for forgiveness from me. Do you take me as your god? You will receive no divine forgiveness from me. You see, it's my job to make you suffer. Burn, fat one. And with the flick of a wrist, arms seemed to just sprout from the ground and grab a hold of him. They tore him down into what seemed to be an endless abyss. All the way down, you could hear that blood-curdling scream from before. Then Spongebob slowly turned, as if nothing had happened. He even let out a small, evil giggle. He then approached, finally, the doors of the Krusty Krab. The path behind him, the usual cheery path to the entrance, had stakes all along it. Into them were hammered the corpses of our familiar favorite characters: Sandy, Mr. Krabs, Larry the Lobster, Pearl, Squidward, Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, Mrs. Puff, and so on. And on their faces, they all too wore that expression of utter sorrow and horror, as if they had died crying in fear of what stood before them. We then transitioned back to Spongebob, who now reached for the door. Then something happened out of this horrible, nightmarish thing I was witnessing. The whole building began to shake, almost as if during an earthquake. The only light in the room blew out, and the power went out. I was now in the dark, alone, in the shaking building. I could hear my fellow interns flee, and the developers run out. Without even a second thought of where I was, you could hear their car tires squeal as they raced away. Why had they been in such a hurry to escape? I then turned back to the show, almost as if I was being forced to watch. He now stood alone in the Krusty Krab. All the lights were out and there was utter silence, except for a small red glow coming from the door that usually led to the kitchen. That oh so familiar kitchen where Spongebob usually stood making his delicacies. He began to approach it in silence. As he reached it, he stood in front of the door, almost as if he himself didn't want to go in. Reproachfully, he turned the knob and the door swung open. Spongebob faced a demon of indescribable horror, burning in a portal to what seemed to be hell itself. Its mouth slowly opened. "Did you make them suffer, son?" it asked, in the most terrible tone imaginable, one of extreme rage, anger, and hatred. Spongebob replied, almost too afraid to. "Yes, Father. They cried, suffered, and burned. A feast of souls waits for you below. It replied simply, "Good son, now back to your cage and be gone with you." Something began to emerge from Spongebob, and his body almost deflated. It almost seemed to be a human, a dog, something. I can't find the words. It crawled toward the portal, and with a swift kick, its father kicked it into what appeared to be hell itself. Then it turned and looked at me, the viewer. It mouthed something, so subtle, so quiet, but chilling to the very core. It seemed as if it was speaking to me. It said, "Don't worry, your world is next. It'll suffer at your hands, as this one did at his." It transitioned over to Spongebob, or what was left of his corpse. "Oh, you'll all atone for what you have done. All of you. You're next." And with that, the computer itself slammed shut and burst into flames. As it slowly burned, I could only weep at this horror. This couldn't be real. Ted, wake up. My eyes flashed open. I was in the break room on the floor. Above me stood my friend Audrey, who said, "Oh, thank goodness you're okay. You just collapsed. You've been out for about 5 minutes." My whole body was rattled, broken almost. Turning to her, I had this uncontrollable urge. I said, "Don't thank God on this day. He won't save us. He has abandoned us. His abominations, his failed creations." Audrey looked aghast, horrified. She ran out screaming. I quickly got up and quietly left. And here I sit, writing my story of the day, calmly. Maybe now I accept my place, and oh, I have work to do. Isn't that right, Audrey? Slowly turning to her dismembered body. You're next. I end with this. I am coming. I am his chosen slayer for this world, a messenger of hell itself. And oh, I am coming for you, each and every one of you. And you'll never stop me. Don't try to run or hide. I will find you.